And I often wonder sometimes with books this short, like how bad could it be? Girl. I am in my horror era right now, so let me tell you my top 10 most memorable horror book recommendations. And this list covers creepy cults, parasitic nightmares, and haunted houses beyond your worst nightmare. And fair warning, my boundaries may not be the same as yours, so check your content warnings for all of these books. So first up is A House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, and this is a haunted house story about a family that discovers that their home is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And this was such an experience. It's the kind of read that's very polarizing where either people love it or they just can't seem to get into it because it's definitely a unique type of story. It's like 3 stories in one almost. This story is really disorienting with intertwining narratives that keep you on edge and with this really deep feeling uneasiness the whole way through. What I loved most about this story is that it's this slow descent into madness for our main character and even a bit of the few secondary characters. And for some other readers, it's a sense of pride in just having accomplished the feat of finishing and understanding this book. And while I understand it's not going to hit for everybody, it definitely landed its place for me. And this list would not be complete without Hell House by Richard Matheson. It follows a group of paranormal investigators who spend time in a known and notoriously haunted house, one of which a few of them have history with. Hell House is one of the most unsettling haunted house stories that I have ever read. It's up there with House of Leaves. The way the haunted house affects the characters mentally and physically is so creepy. I just felt like I needed to shake myself off sometimes. Like, ugh. And Matheson leaves so much unexplained that it only adds to the experience. So if you're into haunted house stories that blend the psychological with the supernatural, and you don't mind things getting a little weird, this is a classic go-to. The Troop by Nick Cutter, and what starts out is a simple Boy Scout trip that devolves very quickly into a nightmare full of parasitic horrors. It's very, very popular in the horror book world, and for good reason. I mean, the horror element here made my skin crawl. The hopelessness that these characters find themselves in with the situation and how fast it spirals beyond their control was intense. And especially adding the layer to that these characters may not be some characters that you might necessarily want to root for. It's a weird juxtaposition against something as benign as a Boy Scout troop journey set against this backdrop of absolute shenanigans. Gone to See the Riverman left a mark. This is basically about a prison groupie trying to be down for her man, and he sends her on this hellish nightmare. This story was absolutely nothing about what I thought I was going to read, and that made it so much worse. It was almost like experiencing 2 different stories at once, which Triana is known for in his books. Our main character, Lori, takes us on a journey that I will never be able to shake off, and she's gonna pull you into some deep, dark, and unexpected places. Even though this is a quick read, it's really got this kind of slow burn tension here, and there are definitely moments where you're going to be internally screaming. To Be Devoured by Sarah Tanslinger was about a woman's descent into madness through her obsession with vultures. This is like 100 pages of WTF. This book takes you into a swan dive into the grotesque, and it's really motivated by obsession and self-destruction. And I often wonder sometimes with books this short, like how bad could it be? Girl. Bluejay by Megan Stockton is a extreme horror novella that I have shouted about from the rooftops, and I just have to share this with you. And this is also another novella about 3 friends weaseling their way into a torture simulation, and it's spiraling very quickly out of their control. Stockton's going to give us some very deeply flawed and unlikable characters and throw them into like this nightmare scenario that spirals out of their control so fast you cannot look away. And given that this is so short, I am always so surprised with how well she did her character development and saying so much with so little space. If you're a fan of the Hostel movie series, you're gonna love this. In Last Days by Adam Neville, 2 young documentary filmmakers take on a project exploring a cult that was active 40 years prior. If you're into cult horror, but you don't want to be drowned in a lot of gore, this is going to be the novel for you. This one really stands out for me because it's a very strong horror, but it has a layer of detailed mystery behind it that sits on top of this slow burn that crescendos up into this nightmarish climax of the story. Now, I will say warning for this is that it unfolds in layers. So there are going to be places where a lot of the narrative overlaps through these different characters, and it's going to feel a bit repetitive, but To me, I think it's worth it because it adds to the tension. This is not a quick punch of a story. Neville is also pretty wordy. I've read a couple of his other novels before. So if you're okay with that level of detail that does add to the word count, I think it's worth it to check this novel out. I'm going to include the Black Farm duology, The Black Farm and Return to the Black Farm, as one. And this duology follows a failed suicide attempt by a couple that has them transported into this nightmarish farm where death is only the beginning. I pretty much read both of these books with my jaw on the floor. This one is definitely hard to read, and this is probably one of the more grotesque books on this list. There's actually a point at the end of The Black Farm that almost had me retching. This duology is a really good blend of extreme horror and dark fantasy in the realm of Lost Gods by Brom, but just way more grotesque. And it's also going to add a layer of existential dread because there are going to be moments where you just can't see any way out for this couple. But I feel like a lot of this story and the message behind it probably is going to get overshadowed because there's a lot of sadism in this book. I'm not even going to hold you. So if that's not your bag, skip this. And I have never felt so helpless reading a book. So let's go to something a tiny bit lighter, which is The Year of Witching by Alexis Henderson. And this is based in a puritanical society where a young woman comes face to face with her lineage, and she faces a dark curse that's tied to witchcraft and rebellion. Henderson just weaves the themes of power, oppression, repression, and rebellion into like this terrifyingly bleak narrative that's gonna have you cheering for our main character the whole time. At some point, I was just like, girl, you could burn them all. Loved this book. Hex is a story that follows a small town that's cursed with its own specter that they keep imprisoned for their protection. The witch at the center of this story is terrifying in her own right, but I found this story to be more about the people in this town than about her. Because I walked into this expecting like this strong terror around this witch, but the real horror here is around how the townspeople deal with her. This curse has been around this town for so long, about 400 years, that they've become desensitized to it in a way, so that when it spirals out of their control, it's almost too late. This one is a creepy read. It takes you to some unexpected places. It's not terribly gory. So if you don't have a strong stomach for that, I think this would be a great horror for you. And this is also a very unique take on the witch trope that I think was absolutely well executed. And lastly, if you are in the mood with something a little bit lighter but still has its moments, you have to read The September House by Carissa Orlando. And this is about a woman who stubbornly remains in her knowingly haunted house even after the disappearance of her husband. This blends horror with heart in a very unexpected way, and I know that sounds weird, but you have to read it in order to understand. This is not cozy by any means, but if you're looking for something deeply, deeply unsettling, this is not going to be it for you. But if you want something like moderately eerie, then definitely check this out. This book shines because of its main characters, in my opinion. I almost didn't even care about the plot. That's how strong the characters were. So while this story was definitely a bit quirky and a bit of a departure from a traditional haunted house story, I think this would be a wonderful read. So if you've read any of these books, let me know where you would have ranked these, if they would have made your top 10. And if you've got a top few favorite horrors, drop them in the comments because I'm always looking out for new horror reads.